I smell the smell of a people lost, broken, wandering, and coming back. Not just to their souls, not just with their minds, but also with their hands, and making not just the desert bloom, but also an amazing wine, amazing cuisine, and an amazing country.
L'chaim.
Better be drunk on Zionism and the joys of Jewish history.
100%. Well said. To be drunk on Zionism and the joys of Jewish history. Who can complain? You're home, so you can drink.
Yes, and you're on camera, you should.
Hi, welcome to Wine with Adam. I'm your host, Adam Scott Bellos, and today we have a very special guest, my very good friend, Dr. Gil Troy. Gil, thank you for joining me on Wine with Adam today.
Always fun to visit with you and drink with you.
It's time too.
Yes.
You were on the very first episode of Wine with Adam once we made it a whole to-do, and we were promoting the book that you had worked on with Natan Sharansky, My Story, and today you are here to talk about another story, another book that you poured your heart and soul into. It is the republishing of the Herzl Diaries with your introduction and editing. Thank you for being here.
Great to be with you.
Today on Wine with Adam, we're going to be drinking the Jezreel Valley 2018 Argaman. And I chose this wine specifically for you, Gil. One, because the Argaman is the only indigenous grape to the land of Israel that we know of. And two, how could we drink anything other than this if we're talking about Theodor Herzl? I also know that you are a huge lover of the Jezreel Valley Winery. And I figured, well, why the hell not? It's the highest rated wine in Israel.
I've had it before because it is indeed one of my favorite
It's one of my favorite bottles of wine too. Just a little background, resume really quickly. Distinguished professor of history at McGill University, former fellow at the Hartman Center. Really, you rose to prominence in the Israel circle with Why I'm a Zionist. Before we dive into the project, I've known you since I made Aliyah. You were one of the first people that I ever reached out to when I moved here and I started writing and trying to figure out how I could get involved in my activism and like kind of transition from being a Jew in the diaspora to a new immigrant. And to me, I just think it's the most interesting thing that you're the man who's bringing Zionism to the next generation. You're kind of this spokesperson of Zionism for almost 2 or 3 different generations. What's that like?
I'm just a kid from Queens who doesn't like to see bullies. And when I was a professor at McGill University in 2000, and all of a sudden the conversation changed. Israel had been involved in the Oslo peace process, and whatever you think about Israel's mistakes, fundamentally, it was an attempt at making peace. Mm-hmm. And when the Palestinians decided, after the Camp David negotiations in July 2000, that they were fed up, Yasser Arafat didn't even give a counteroffer to Ehud Barak's way too generous offer, and they turned right back to terrorism, even though, of course, terrorism had been building. I was shocked at McGill University, and actually throughout all of North America, everybody all of a sudden is blaming Israel again. And the speed with which people forgot Israel's attempts to make peace, and the speed with which people went back into their happy space of negating Zionism was really traumatic for me, especially because it was at the university, the place that I worshiped, the place that I loved. And so I started writing and celebrating Zionism, not for anybody else, but for me. Because I didn't want to live in a world where Israel was being beaten up. I didn't want to live in a world where Zionism was being beaten up. And it has actually been very gratifying to meet people like you and so many others over the years who, after my Why I'm a Zionist essay, which came out in April 2001, before 9/11, when terrorism was just spreading here and people weren't paying attention to it there. And all of a sudden people responded, and what I didn't expect was how many people throughout the Jewish world said, thank you, somebody's saying something positive. And that's when I started what I call this journey of identity Zionism, singing a new song of Zion.
You constantly use this term all the time, identity Zionism. Define identity Zionism for the viewers.
Identity Zionism is in an age of identity, in an age of identity politics, is my mischievous way of saying that fundamentally we have to remember how central Zionism, Israel, Jewish peoplehood are to modern Jewish identity. And I think if Theodor Herzl said the central Judenfrage, the central Jewish problem and Jewish question of the 19th century was anti-Semitism and even assimilation, I think the fundamental challenge today for modern young Western Jews and non-Jews is identity. We live in a world of anomie, as Durkheim called it. We live in a world of so many stripped identities, broken identities, even as people take on these very aggressive kind of identities. And so to me, identity Zionism is a tikkun, is a fixing. It's saying in this world where so many people feel lost, I'm not arrogant enough to say that we're the best or the only, but we are lucky enough to be part of this 3,500-year-old conversation about meaning. We're lucky enough to be part of this 3,500-year-old community which looks out for one another, such that you know that you're never alone, which was the theme of the Natan Sharansky book. And we're lucky enough to be a part of this great adventure, which starts 3,500 years ago and now most recently is a 75-year-old experiment in Jewish democracy. So identity Zionism is saying, yes, of course there are political dimensions to Zionism. Yes, of course there are all these other different schools of Zionist thought. But in the 21st century, my appeal to young people, and frankly, to their parents, is that we are in an age of identity Zionism.
But did you ever think that you would start taking the older Zionist works and re-editing them? I mean, it's a pretty prestigious place to be in now, doing Herzl's Diaries. This is something of a whole different level.
So in 2001, I published Why I'm a Zionist, which is my ani ma'amin, my personal statement about how lucky we are to be living in this era of a Jewish state with all the challenges. Unfortunately, we live in a world where you can't just celebrate Zionism, as I did in Why I'm a Zionist. And so in 2012, I came out with a book called Moynihan's Moment, which was, I was looking for a liberal Democrat. I was looking for a non-Jew who stood up for Israel and the Jewish people.
This was like a mindset that you had.
This is a mindset that I had.
You didn't say, I want to write a book about Zionism as racism. You said,
I wanted to find a role model
Okay.
for young Jews and non-Jews. And from there, I'm given the tremendous honor and privilege and challenge of updating Arthur Hertzberg's book from 1959, The Zionist Idea.
Right.
And so you add an S to open up the conversation. And add questions, not just exclamation points. And invite people into a rigorous, exciting, inspiring conversation about what Zionism was before the state, the founders, the pioneers, who the builders were who established the state, and who we are, the torchbearers. And then all of a sudden, Matthew Miller of Koren Books calls me up and he says, Gil, I've got a project for you. What is it? He wants to launch this thing called the Library of the Jewish People. We are the people of the book. We are a people with such a sophisticated library, and so many of us in this generation don't know it. And so the Library of the Jewish People is an attempt to create beautiful books that respect the power of the written word and that tell the story of the Jewish people through words. And the first 3 volumes were these 3 volumes of the Zionist writings of Theodor Herzl. And
now, I want to clarify, these are his entire diary entries.
You read these diaries and you are with Herzl every day of his journey. So what you see are his letters, his diaries, and his diaries are very personal and very experimental, and he's improvising, he's riffing.
One of the things that you talk about is the historical context of his writings and how, and you mentioned this more than once, how people like to take bits and pieces of his writings and use it to either for a pro-Zionist argument or an anti-Zionist argument.
So, most important,
okay,
we have to approach the diaries as the political science equivalent of an artist's sketchbook.
Okay.
I'm lucky to be married to an artist.
Okay.
And what an artist does is the beautiful paintings you see are not just boom, immaculate conception, but they're part of an agonizing process. What does that mean? He has an idea. He wakes up in the morning and he's a tinkerer. The other really exciting thing about the diaries is you see him just tinkering, thinking. He gets excited by this idea of a Jewish state, and he wakes up every morning saying, how can we make it happen? How can we make it better? What could we do? And so you have to understand, first of all, that it's really just like his musings, right? The Herzl of 1890 is not the same Herzl as 1895 and not the same Herzl of 1897. That Jewish question has been weighing on him for years, not just for months. And he says, I'm just going to write a play. And he writes this play called The New Ghetto. And there isn't one positive Jewish image, Jewish character in the entire play. Each one of them is either assimilationist or money-grubbing or weak or sniveling. So much so that his friend Arthur Schnitzler, a great and more famous playwright than Herzl was in his time, writes in his novel in 1906, I actually never really met an anti-Semite, except there was one Zionist leader I know who truly hated Jews, and he's talking about Herzl. So what happens? During these 3 weeks, when he's already started writing, is when the Dreyfus trial happens. And he watches this French army captain who embodies every Jew's dream. Get out of the ghetto, be accepted. Not just belong, but be a French army captain, right? You'll get, what could be better? And then he's framed. And when he's attacked on the streets of Paris, the crowds don't yell, down with Dreyfus, down with that individual, but down with la Juif, death to the Jews. And that's when Herzl has what he calls his Herzl moment. So the two things that we understand are, one, I think writing that play and getting to that edge of despair, reinforced by the Dreyfus trial, pushed him so far that he said, wait a minute, we need something. And at that moment of despair, that's when he said, I have an answer. We are a people, and he writes that in Der Judenstaat. We are a people, we have ties to a particular homeland, we've got to go home. So it's a critical moment in his journey, and that's why, again, we say journals and journey, because you see that the Herzl who's writing at the beginning of 1895, in October 1895, is not the same Herzl who's writing it in 1896. And what did he discover through that despair? What's the opposite of despair? Hope. And he makes that leap of hope. And that's when Herzl becomes Herzl. And the leap of hope is, first, that tomorrow will be better than today. But second, that the only way to make tomorrow better than today is to roll up your sleeves and make it happen. The genius of Herzl is not just that he was an image-oriented Jew and the first really beautiful Jew, but also he has training both as a lawyer and a playwright. And you see the two sides. You see the statesman side, and you see the playwright side. He never really succeeds in writing that play that rocks the world, but he actually does, because he writes the play that rocks the world. It's called Zionism. So what does he do? He reduces what just took me 3.5 minutes to explain into a three-act play. 1, we assimilated. 2, we discover they hate us. Thesis, antithesis. 3, synthesis, Zionism. And so he is the originator of the great myth about himself. So could we, as people who know Zionism, list 20 other Zionist figures who should perhaps be as worshipped? Maybe.
For sure.
But Herzl became the guy.
Yeah.
And part of it was, as I said earlier, his own genius, and I don't use that word lightly, in telling his own story and rewriting his own story and being the author of his own legend.
Everything that he does is theatrical, down to how he conducted the first Zionist Congress.
The fact that to this day, in Tel Aviv and in Herzliya and in Jerusalem, you can see images of Herzl, right? And sometimes it's the real image, and sometimes it's him as a hipster. The twist shows his understanding. It works!
Yeah.
The con worked,
Yeah.
right? The game worked. And I think
No, he was fake it till you make it,
right.
by definition.
And tell the story, right? And sing a song, and if the melody is good enough, everybody will catch on,
Right.
But he knows the words are important, but also the melody is really important too. And at this moment in time when, let's be honest, there's a lot of division in the country. There's a lot of upset around the word Zionism, around the word Israel, around our government. You could say, wait a minute, how could it be that Bibi Netanyahu in his memoir calls Theodor Herzl the modern Moses and worships at the shrine of Herzl? And how could it be that a few years ago on the streets of Tel Aviv, when left-wingers had what we call the cottage cheese protest, and they built those tents on Rothschild Boulevard to protest Bibi and protest the right and protest the high cost of living here, they also used all kinds of Herzl images. Does it mean that Herzl is empty? Does it mean that Herzl is insignificant? Does it mean that any one of us can hijack Herzl's image to push our political agenda? No, the opposite. It reminds us, during this moment of great polarization, this moment of great tension, that there are certain things that still unite us. There are certain things about peoplehood, about hating the haters, about looking out for one another, about having a sense of community, about having a sense of tradition that still keep Israel together and still keep the Jewish people together.
It's almost like Herzl belongs to every single Jew. But one of the things that I found very interesting was how you talk about how he becomes more Jewish over time.
So let's take 3 significant moments.
Okay,
there.
fine.
One is it's 1897, and he's on his way to the Zionist Congress. He comes to Basel, and the conference starts on a Sunday. That Shabbat, the day before, he goes to the synagogue in Basel to show respect. And he writes in his diaries this delicious thing. He says, of all my worries about the Zionist Congress, the thing that made me most anxious, and he uses the German word anxiety, that gave me most anxiety, was getting the aliyah to the Torah, getting called up to the Torah. Why? Because he said, I didn't know if I would get the words right. I think this should be told to every bar mitzvah boy and girl. Here you have this man in his 30s who's launching this amazing thing, and he's nervous. And why? Because he doesn't want to look like a fool. And he understands, again, this is Herzl as the showman, how important it is that he not look like the fool. And then, as you point out, he writes this beautiful short story, which every one of us should read, called The Menorah, in which he talks about how when the chief rabbi of Vienna came to visit him, and he was lighting the Christmas tree, he wasn't embarrassed the year before, but then he brings a Chanukiah, a menorah, into his house. And he lights one light after another after another. And he says, what happens day after day? More light comes into the house. And he says, that is my journey. So yeah, you could see that he wanted to have a mass conversion in 1894, but in 1897 he understands, no, this is who we are, this is who I am, I want to bring light in, we'll defeat the darkness. I mean, when he's talking about that, it's not just defeating the anti-Semites, but defeating the emptiness within. That's identity Zionism, that's Herzl.
It's almost, it really is a test. Herzl's journey is a testament to most people's journey, and that you can't really forget that most people do evolve over time. Politicians evolve, academics evolve, filmmakers evolve with their work. And to say that, like you were saying before, to take certain things from different time periods and to quote them out of context is just it's totally throwing out the entirety of his journey out the window. I want to ask you, before I give you my final question, there's one other specific thing that I found extremely interesting that you wrote about, and again, something I did not know. I had no idea that Herzl sat with the Rothschilds. Okay, that I did not know, and I have no idea how I didn't know that, and I also didn't know, I have no idea how I never learned about his criticism of what the Rothschilds were doing in Ottoman Palestine, okay, and pre-state Israel, is that he felt that they were creating a society of beggars. And
Schnurrs, yeah. He actually uses the Yiddish word schnurrs, beggars. Yeah.
He had some extremely harsh criticism of the uber wealthy Jewish class, both in America and in Europe, and that they wanted to control things with their money when it wasn't necessarily, like, their money was important to the cause, but their ideas weren't necessarily the right ideas to move what he was doing forward. Okay, I know I'm treading on some touchy subject here. I'm trying to make this about the somewhat unhealthy situation that does exist with the uber wealthy class of Jewish philanthropists that are putting their money in things because they want to see it happen, but not necessarily thinking about what a young Jew wants to see happen or what a young Jew needs.
One of these days I'm going to write a column where I take Herzl's sharpest, most biting comments about his fellow Jews.
You're going to let everybody know what you're going to do before you're going to do it.
And list it, and then people are going to think it's Gil Troy saying it, and I was going to say it's Theodor Herzl. And so one of the fun things in the diary is to see his growing fury at the wealthy Jews, and particularly at the Rothschilds, because just like for the anti-Semites, for the Jews also, they become the symbol. But there's a great Herzlian moment. You talked about Herzl moments where he switches. He comes to England. Now he's going to sit with the British branch of the Rothschild clan. And he comes in loaded for bear. And he's ready to hate them. And the first lunch is a little testy. And at one point, he pushes back somewhat rudely. But Rothschilds are not used to being manhandled like that. And they kind of like it. Because they realize, hey, somebody came to our table who's finally somebody real. And from that, he actually creates a beautiful relationship and friendship with the Rothschilds. Is there a happy ending? Did they fund every one of his Zionist dreams? No. But it's actually a great story because it shows that he actually had enough confidence and enough class confidence, right? If we talk about...
He had kishkas.
He had kishkas.
He grew up in enlightened...
and he knows how to play with
upper
them,
middle class
right? And he's not
European.
going to be pushed around.
Well, listen, I want to wrap up. I'm getting ready for my bar mitzvah. Sum up everything you ever learned in one sentence.
I think Herzl would go back to his cliche, Im Tirtzu ein so agada. If you will, it is no dream, it is no fairy tale. I think if he came back here today, everybody says, what would Herzl think if he saw? He would be blown away. He would say, it worked. The con worked. I know I'm a showman. I know I'm a playwright. I know I was selling something to everybody, but they bought it because the world needed it. So I think he would really say, from your dreams, you can move mountains. And I keep on saying it's the leap of hope. I keep on saying, because I'm so despairing over the despair. I'm so annoyed and frustrated that people have forgotten how lucky we are to be living in this moment. In the United States of America, for all its challenges. In Israel, for all our challenges. Look how far we've come. I know there are problems, and I want to use Herzl's diaries and Herzl's ideas as tools to help fix those problems. But fundamentally, I also want to use the Herzl story for us to stop, take a breath, lift a glass, and say, L'chaim, we are so lucky to be living in this moment. That's the leap of hope.
L'chaim to that. On that note, I'd like to say thank you so much to my good friend, Gil Troy, for joining me today on today's episode of Wine with Adam. I also want to say thank you very much to the Jezreel Winery for providing us a great bottle of the Argaman. And if you like this wine, you can get it at wineonthevine.com. If you want to plant a vine with the Jezreel Valley Winery, you can plant a vine at wineonthevine.org/JNS. And if you like this video, click subscribe and give it a share. And remember, when you're drinking your Israeli wine, drink it with somebody you love. L'chaim.